I remember that night like it was yesterday. It still haunts me, even though years have passed. The bus stop was an ordinary one, just a shelter by the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. I had never thought much of it, just a stop on the way to work, a place I visited daily. But that night was different. It was a late evening, and I had just finished my shift at the diner. The streets were quiet, a little too quiet for my liking. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway eerily. The usual buzz of cars and people was nowhere to be heard, which struck me as strange for this time of night. As I made my way to the bus stop, a chill crept down my spine. I shook it off, thinking it was just the cold air, but something felt off. I was the only person waiting at the bus stop. It wasn't unusual for me, but tonight the silence seemed unbearable. The dim streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. I glanced down the road, expecting to see headlights, but nothing. It was as if the world had frozen, holding its breath. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Not just one set, but multiple. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone else waiting for the bus. But there was no one there. I squinted into the darkness, my heart racing. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, but I still couldn't see anyone. It felt like someone was right behind me, their presence just out of sight. I tried to calm myself, thinking it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. But then I heard a voice, soft and raspy, coming from the shadows. "You're alone, aren't you?" The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't respond, too afraid to even turn around. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as the voice spoke again, this time closer, as though whoever was speaking was standing right behind me. "Don't worry, I won't hurt you. Not yet." I froze. Every instinct told me to run, to get away from this place, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, like there was something pressing down on me. My eyes darted around the bus stop, searching for any sign of help, but the area remained deserted. Then I heard the sound of someone sitting down on the bench next to me. But when I looked, the bench was empty. I blinked, and for a moment I thought I was imagining things. But the sound was real. "Where is it you're going?" The voice asked again, still from behind me. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The air around me felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't describe. My breath came out in shallow gasps, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my skin. Then a figure appeared in front of me. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but as it grew clearer, I realized it was a person. Tall, hunched, with pale skin that seemed almost sickly under the dim light. Their clothes were old, ragged, as if they had been worn for years without being washed. The face was what got to me, though. The eyes were hollow, dark voids, empty like they had been drained of life. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure standing in front of me. It slowly leaned closer, its breath cold and musty, like something decayed. "Don't be afraid," it whispered, though it wasn't reassuring in the least. "You're safe here. You'll be here forever." I finally found my voice, but it came out a hoarse whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its empty eyes staring into mine, unblinking. "I want you to stay, to wait with me, to wait for the bus that never comes." I felt my heart race, panic seizing my chest. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But everything about it, every bone-chilling second of it, felt all too real. The figure's lips curled into a grin, a smile that didn't belong on a human face, more like a grimace of something unnatural. Before I could even process what was happening, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. The bus stop, the bench, the road. Everything began to blur, as if reality itself was warping around me. I looked up at the streetlights, but they flickered violently, casting strange, elongated shadows that moved of their own accord. And then the figure moved. Not like a human, but more like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Its limbs jerked in unnatural ways, too long, too twisted. It stood up and took a step towards me, its gaze still fixed on mine. "You're already here," it said, its voice a rasping, gravelly sound. "You don't need to wait any longer. The bus is always on its way, but it never arrives. We're all waiting for something that'll never come." I stumbled backward, my mind racing for a way out. There had to be a way. But then the world around me shifted once again. The bus stop, the road, the streetlights, They all dissolved into darkness, leaving me in a vast, empty void. The figure was gone, but I was still there, alone. The footsteps, the voice, the presence, they were all gone. The silence was suffocating. I thought I was losing my mind, trapped in some kind of nightmare. But then I heard it again. The soft sound of footsteps. But this time they weren't in the distance, they were right beside me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned my head. And there, standing next to me, was the figure once more. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and it spoke in that same low, rasping voice. "Did you think you could leave? There's nowhere to go." I tried to run, to escape, but the darkness closed in around me. The figure followed me, its distorted form flickering in and out of sight. No matter where I went, no matter how fast I ran, the bus stop remained the same. The same empty road, the same flickering lights, the same voice echoing in my ears. "You can never leave," it whispered, and then the bus arrived, or at least it seemed to. It wasn't like any bus I had ever seen. The doors creaked open slowly, and I felt an overwhelming urge to step inside. But as I took a step forward, I saw the driver, a figure with a face too blurred to make out, staring straight ahead, unmoving. I stopped just short of the door. Something in my gut told me that getting on that bus would be the last thing I ever did. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. The world around me was still, quiet. No sound, no movement. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally mustered the courage to turn around and walk away, I was still in the same place. The bus stop. The same empty street. The same silence. The same dread. I still don't know what happened that night, or if it was even real. Maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe I had fallen asleep at the bus stop. But the memory of that night, the figure, the voice, it still lingers with me. Sometimes when I stand at a bus stop late at night, I hear those footsteps again, and I wonder if I'm just waiting for a bus that will never come.
Next story.
It was a late autumn evening, the kind of night where the chill in the air bites at your skin and the moon casts an eerie glow over the deserted streets. I was waiting for the bus at the stop near the edge of town, the one that nobody really used unless they had no choice. It wasn't a popular stop, not like the ones closer to the main part of the city. The area around it was mostly old houses, overgrown yards, and trees that seemed to stretch out like skeletal hands, casting long shadows. The bus was supposed to be there in about 10 minutes, but I had time to kill. I buried my hands in my jacket pockets and tried to keep warm, my breath visible in the cold night air. The streetlights flickered overhead, the buzzing sound they made almost loud in the stillness. As I stood there, I kept my eyes on the road, occasionally glancing down at the dark sidewalk that stretched into the distance. I wasn't the only one waiting at the stop. There was a woman there, standing near the bench, staring straight ahead as if lost in thought. She had long dark hair, almost black, and she wore a coat that was too thin for the weather. It didn't make sense for her to be there at this hour, but I thought little of it at first. She didn't seem threatening, just distant. I tried to make small talk, but she didn't respond. Maybe she didn't hear me, so I said nothing more and turned back to the road. The silence around us grew thicker, oppressive. It was a strange kind of quiet, as though the world was holding its breath. I checked my watch. The bus was still a few minutes away, but something felt off. My instincts were kicking in, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I glanced back at the woman. She was still standing there, but something had changed. She wasn't just standing anymore. She was facing me, and her eyes were locked on mine. At first, I thought I imagined it. Maybe it was just the way the light hit her face, but no. Her gaze was intense, unblinking, and oddly empty. It made my stomach turn, but I couldn't look away. Something about it felt wrong. Her eyes were wide, but there was no warmth, no recognition in them. They were just hollow. I took a step back, then another, instinctively distancing myself from her. My heart started to race, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I looked down the street again, praying the bus would arrive soon. It wasn't like me to be paranoid, but in that moment it felt like something was watching, something more than just the woman. That's when I heard it. A soft voice, almost a whisper. "You're not safe here." I froze. The voice wasn't hers. I turned to look at the woman, but her lips didn't move. Her eyes remained locked on mine, but she hadn't said a word. The voice had come from somewhere else, somewhere close. I scanned the street, but saw nothing. My breath quickened, and the hairs on my neck prickled even more. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud against the still night. No answer. I took another step back, my heart pounding harder now. The whisper had chilled me to my core, but there was nothing I could do about it. I was stuck at the stop until the bus arrived, and I couldn't leave without it. I forced myself to calm down, to breathe, to think rationally. It had to be the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. It had to be. But the longer I stood there, the more uneasy I became. The shadows around the bus stop seemed to grow deeper, like they were moving in closer, swallowing the light from the street lamps. The air felt heavier. My throat was dry, my body tense. That's when I saw her move. The woman at the bench was no longer standing. She was walking toward me now, slow and deliberate. I should have left, should have run, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, as if some invisible force was holding me there. She didn't speak. She didn't make a sound as she came closer, her eyes never leaving mine. I wanted to shout, to scream, but nothing came out. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was paralyzed, like I was stuck in some kind of dream I couldn't wake up from. When she was only a few feet away, she stopped. She tilted her head slightly, had still staring at me, and then finally, her lips parted, though not a word came out. Instead, a chill rushed through me as if the very air around me had turned to ice. I felt it then, a deep sense of wrongness, a suffocating dread that was unlike anything I had ever felt before. The wind picked up, howling through the trees behind us, but the woman didn't react. She just stood there as if waiting for something. Her eyes were locked onto mine, and I felt trapped. Her skin was pale, almost sickly, and there was something about the way she stood that didn't seem human. Her movements were too smooth, too unnatural. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't obey. She took another step forward, and I felt the coldness in the air intensify, like it was wrapping itself around me, choking me. "Why are you here?" I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out. Her fingers were cold, so cold that it felt like they were freezing the air around them. I could see her hand trembling, as if trying to fight some invisible force. But then, her fingers brushed against my arm. A sharp jolt of ice spread through my skin at the touch, and I gasped, finally able to move. I stumbled backward, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. That's when I heard the bus. It was a sound I hadn't heard in what felt like an eternity, the low rumble of the engine in the distance. It was coming. I turned my head to the street, but when I looked back, the woman was gone. She was just gone. I didn't see her move, didn't hear a sound. One moment, she was standing there, and the next, she wasn't. But something told me she hadn't left. Something told me that she was still watching from somewhere, waiting. I bolted for the street as the bus finally appeared, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't look back as I climbed aboard, almost tripping in my haste. The doors closed behind me with a hiss, and the driver didn't ask any questions as I sank into an empty seat, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't look back to see if she was there. I didn't need to. I knew. The bus drove on, but the unease didn't fade. Even as the lights of the town came into view, I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck never went down, and every time I glanced out the window, the streetlights seemed to flicker, casting strange, twisting shadows that danced just out of sight. When I finally got off at my stop, the night felt different. The air still held that strange, unnatural chill, and I hurried home, hoping that whatever had happened at that bus stop would stay behind. But sometimes, when I'm walking late at night, when the wind is cold and the shadows are long, I feel her eyes on me. And I wonder, in the back of my mind, if she's still waiting for me at that bus stop, waiting for me to return.
Next story.
It was a cold, foggy night when I found myself waiting at that bus stop. The kind of night where the chill seeps into your bones and the world feels silent, almost too silent. I had been out at a friend's place, celebrating her birthday, and of course I'd missed the last bus. I was used to walking home, but the night felt too eerie, and besides, I didn't feel like dealing with the cold for another hour. I had no choice but to wait for the next one, hoping it would come soon. The bus stop was situated at the corner of an old, run-down street, far from the lively part of town. The area wasn't dangerous per se, but it wasn't the kind of place you'd want to spend too much time after dark. There was an old diner across the street, its neon sign flickering like it was on its last legs. I could see the shadows of a few cars parked along the curb, but no one seemed to be around. I sat on the wooden bench, the cold seeping through my jacket. My breath formed little clouds in the air, and I tried to distract myself with my phone, but the screen was so dim it felt like I wasn't even really looking at it. I looked around again, the street eerily quiet. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought she was just another person waiting for the bus. She was standing near the corner of the street, near a dark alley that led to a few houses. She was wearing a long, dark coat and had her hands buried deep in the pockets. Her hair was tucked under a scarf, and the low light made it hard to make out any details about her, but there was something about her that felt off. I couldn't explain it, but the more I looked at her, the more it felt like she didn't belong. She wasn't just standing there waiting for a bus, she was waiting for something. Her gaze was fixed, staring ahead like she could see something that wasn't there. And then, without warning, she turned and started walking toward me. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but there was a heaviness in the air now. The streetlights buzzed in a way that made my skin crawl. I could feel her presence getting closer, and my heart began to race. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little too soft, too quiet. I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat. I looked up at her, still too caught off guard to speak. She was standing a few feet away now, her eyes locked on mine. Her face was pale, almost too pale, and her eyes were wide and empty, as though she hadn't blinked in hours. It was unnerving. "Are you waiting for the bus?" she asked again, a slight tremor in her voice. "Yeah," I said, nodding quickly. "It should be here any minute." She didn't respond right away, just kept staring at me. Then, after a long pause, she said something that made my blood run cold. "The bus doesn't come anymore." I furrowed my brow, confused. "What do you mean the bus is coming?" Her eyes darkened, and she stepped closer, her breath now visible in the cold air. She leaned in slightly, and I could smell something rancid like rotting leaves or decay. "You don't understand. It's already gone." I looked at her more closely, trying to make sense of what she was saying. But before I could ask her what she meant, I saw it. In the distance, faint at first but growing closer. Headlights. A bus. I could see the familiar shape of the vehicle, the orange glow of the lights coming around the corner just like any other night. Except this one was different. There was something about it. The bus, it wasn't right. The headlights flickered unnaturally, and the bus was moving too slowly, creeping toward us with an eerie silence. The more I looked at it, the more it felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. The closer it got, the more my stomach churned. The woman was still standing beside me, her eyes fixed on the bus as it slowly rolled to a stop. She didn't move, didn't speak. And I couldn't tear my eyes away either. The doors of the bus creaked open, and I was struck with an overwhelming sense of dread, as though stepping on that bus would be the worst mistake of my life. "Don't get on," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible now. I glanced at her in confusion. "What are you talking about?" But before I could ask again, the doors opened fully. The interior of the bus was dark, almost too dark. There were no seats, just rows of empty, shadowed space that seemed to stretch on forever. There was no driver, no passengers, just silence. And then a figure appeared in the doorway. A tall man, his face obscured by shadows, wearing a long, dark coat, much like the woman. But this figure wasn't like her. There was something wrong with him. Something that made every part of me scream to run. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The way he looked at me like I was nothing more than a choice, a decision to be made, was enough. It was like he was inviting me, beckoning me, telling me that I had to get on. I could feel my legs moving toward the bus without me consciously deciding to take a step. My feet shuffled forward, closer to the doors. I could hear the woman behind me, her voice trembling, almost as though she was begging me. "No, don't, please," she whispered. But I couldn't stop myself. I was already on the bus, the cold air hitting me as I stepped inside. The figure stood at the front, silent, motionless. The doors slammed shut behind me. I tried to turn around to step back out, but the doors wouldn't open. The bus was already moving, pulling away from the curb, gliding down the street with an unnatural smoothness. There were no sounds, No engine, no wheels on pavement. Just the quiet hum of something that shouldn't be moving, yet was. I turned back toward the interior of the bus and my heart sank. There, sitting in the empty seats, were people. But they weren't people. They were shapes, shapeless figures with no faces, no eyes, nothing but empty, hollow voids where their features should have been. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. They just sat there, staring straight ahead, unmoving. I was frozen in place, my feet unable to move, my hands unable to reach for the door. The man in the front turned slowly, his face still hidden in the shadows, and finally spoke. The bus never stops. It takes you wherever you need to go. I was about to scream, to beg for the doors to open, when I heard a voice behind me, soft, familiar. Don't get off. I turned around, heart racing. The woman from the bus stop was there, standing among the faceless passengers. She looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. This place, this bus, it doesn't go where you think it does, she said, her voice trembling. Before I could ask her what she meant, the man in the front of the bus spoke again, his voice like cold, decaying gravel. You're already too late. The last thing I remember is the bus moving faster, the shadows closing in, and the realization that I would never step off, that I was already on my way to somewhere I couldn't escape.
Next story.
I had never been one to believe in ghosts. I was a practical person, grounded in the here and now. I preferred logic and reason to superstition and stories. But that night changed everything. It was a Tuesday, late in the evening, when I found myself waiting at a bus stop in the middle of nowhere. The kind of bus stop that didn't belong in the city. The kind that was isolated, tucked away on the edge of town, where the streetlights flickered and the wind made everything feel a little too eerie. The only reason I was there was because I had missed the last bus and was stuck waiting for the next one. I'd been out late, visiting a friend in a nearby neighborhood, and I hadn't realized how dark it had gotten. The stop itself was a small, rundown structure, a metal bench with a rusted frame, a cracked sign, and a lamppost that barely lit the area. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The street was empty, no cars, no pedestrians, just the faint hum of distant traffic. It felt like time itself was standing still. I looked at my watch. It was after 11 p.m., and the bus wouldn't be arriving for at least another 15 minutes. I pulled out my phone and tried to pass the time, scrolling through social media, but the signal was weak and the screen kept freezing. I sighed and put it back in my pocket, resigning myself to the fact that I'd have to wait in the silence. That's when I saw him. I didn't notice him at first, but when I looked up from my phone, I saw a man standing a few feet away from me. He was just standing there, as if he had appeared out of nowhere. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He was standing perfectly still, staring ahead at the road. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was late, and people were always walking around at odd hours, but something about him felt off, like he didn't belong in that place, in that moment. I tried to ignore him and look back at my watch, but when I glanced up again, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. He hadn't moved, not even an inch. His posture was too stiff, too rigid, like he was frozen in time. I shifted uneasily on the bench, but I didn't want to look like I was staring. I told myself I was being paranoid, that he was just some late-night wanderer waiting for the bus, just like me. But then he spoke. "Do you believe in ghosts?" His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried through the still air like it was meant for me. I froze. The question didn't make sense. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure if I'd even heard him correctly. "What?" I stammered, my voice shaky. He didn't turn to look at me, but I could feel his gaze on me, like he was watching every move I made. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked again, his voice growing slightly more insistent. I was about to brush it off, tell him I wasn't interested in whatever strange conversation he was trying to start, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The bus stop was still empty, no one else around, but now I could see something behind him, a shadow. It wasn't like a regular shadow, though. It was darker than the night itself, and it seemed to stretch unnaturally across the ground. It was like the shadow was trying to swallow him whole, like it was trying to pull him into the dark. I felt my heart begin to race. Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. My breath came in short gasps as I stood up, stepping away from the bench. The man turned slowly, his movements deliberate, like they were forced, and when he looked at me, his eyes were empty, black holes that seemed to suck in all light, all color. His face was pale, too pale, and his lips twisted into a smile that was anything but friendly. "I'm not supposed to be here," he whispered, his smile growing wider. "I've been waiting for so long." I took a step back, my legs shaking beneath me. "Waiting for what?" "For you," he said softly, his voice sending a shiver down my spine. "I've been waiting for you." I didn't understand. Who was this man? Why was he here? Why was he looking at me like that? Before I could ask anything else, the air around me seemed to shift. It got colder, much colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The shadows behind him stretched further, creeping along the ground like they had a mind of their own. The man took another step toward me, and suddenly I heard a sound, a low rumbling growl like something alive, something huge, was getting closer. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I spun around looking for an escape. And then I saw it. The bus. But this wasn't the same bus that I had been waiting for. This one was different. It was huge, almost impossibly large, with windows that seemed too dark, too empty. It didn't have the familiar lights of a regular bus. It had a strange, sickly yellow glow. And there, standing at the door, was another figure. A woman, her face hidden by a veil, her form shrouded in darkness. The man's voice broke through the pounding in my ears. "Get on," he said, his voice low and commanding. "You have to get on." I shook my head, stepping back again. The figure behind him, the one that had been in the shadows, was moving now, sliding along the ground, as if it were part of the darkness itself. It was almost like the shadows were alive and they were closing in on me. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, I won't get on." The man's eyes narrowed, his smile faltering for a moment. "It's already too late," he said. "The bus is here. You're already on your way." Before I could even think, I felt something grab me from behind. A cold, invisible hand that pulled me toward the bus. I screamed, but it was as if the sound was swallowed by the night, leaving nothing but the silence and the growing darkness. I struggled, trying to break free, but it was no use. The figure in the veil stood at the door, watching me with empty eyes, her lips barely moving as she spoke. "Come in," she whispered. I didn't have a choice. The moment I stepped onto the bus, the doors slammed shut behind me and everything went dark. I don't know how long I was on that bus. Minutes? Hours? The only thing I know is that when I woke up, I wasn't at the bus stop anymore. I was in a place that was too dark to describe, a place that felt wrong. There was no light, no sound, just a vast, endless void, and as I tried to move to scream like nothing happened, I was stuck, trapped in a place I didn't understand. And then I saw him again. The man. He was standing there staring at me, his smile still stretched across his face. "You were always meant to be here," he said softly. I didn't know what that meant, but I was beginning to understand something else. The bus never leaves, and neither will I.
Next story.
I never thought much about ghost stories. Not the real ones, anyway. The ones people tell around campfires or in dimly lit rooms to frighten each other. I always figured they were just that, stories. But that night I found out firsthand that some things aren't meant to be explained. It all started when I decided to take the bus home from work. My usual routine had been disrupted a bit that evening. I had stayed late to finish a project at the office and ended up missing the earlier bus. By the time I stepped out onto the street, the last normal bus had already left, and I found myself standing at a nearly deserted bus stop. It was a stretch of road I didn't particularly like. The streetlights were far apart, and the shadows seemed to go on forever. I could barely see the faces of the few cars passing by, and the wind had an unsettling chill. It felt like the city was holding its breath, waiting for something. I glanced at my phone. The next bus wasn't due for another 20 minutes. I pulled my jacket tighter, huddling against the cold. The bus stop was a small metal shelter with a bench that was more rust than anything else. A few torn advertisements flapped against the glass, and the cracked asphalt beneath me seemed to be melting in the dim light. Then I noticed him. At first, I thought he was just another person waiting for the bus, but there was something wrong. I don't know how to explain it. He was standing under the far street lamp, his back to me. He was wearing a long, dark coat, his face obscured by a hat. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even looking around, just standing still. I tried not to stare. It was late, and I didn't need to make it awkward, but something about him kept pulling my attention. It was like he was a part of the night, like he blended into the shadows in a way that felt unnatural. After a few minutes, I heard his voice. "Cold night, isn't it?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. I hadn't even noticed him approach. He was standing right beside me now, his presence looming, even though he didn't seem to be physically imposing. "Yeah," I mumbled, uncomfortable. "Just waiting for the bus. It'll be here soon." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stood there, silent, as if he was weighing my words. His face was still shadowed under his hat, and I couldn't see his eyes. But I felt them on me. Watching. Always watching. I glanced back at the bus schedule to break the awkward silence, but when I looked back up, the man was gone. Just like that, one moment he was standing there, and the next he had vanished into the dark. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured he had walked off maybe to catch a cab or something. It was only when I heard the bus approaching that I noticed how much time had passed. That man, whoever he was, had been standing there for much longer than I thought. It was as if he had been part of some strange pause in time, and now the world was moving again. The bus arrived, pulling up with its usual hiss of the brakes. I stepped on, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had crept up on me. The bus was nearly empty, save for a few other people scattered across the seats. I found an empty spot near the back and sat down, pulling my hood up to block out the cold that seemed to follow me onto the bus. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engine lull me into a sort of daze. But then I felt it. Someone was watching me. I opened my eyes, and my heart skipped a beat. The man from the bus stop was sitting a few seats ahead of me. But this time, his face was visible, or at least partially. He wasn't wearing a hat, and his hair was long, thin, and dark. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes, they weren't right. They were wide, too wide, and they seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the bus. I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things. But no, there he was, staring directly at me, his eyes unblinking like he was waiting for something. I felt a cold sweat break out along the back of my neck. My pulse began to race. I didn't want to be near him, but I couldn't look away. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel it. Something was wrong. His stare was suffocating. I leaned forward to see if the bus driver was noticing the strange man, but the front of the bus was empty. The driver's seat was just a dark shadow, the rearview mirror reflecting nothing but the empty road behind us. I stood up, my legs unsteady. Something told me that the sooner I got off this bus, the better. The doors hissed open as the bus approached my stop. I was the only one getting off at this hour, and I didn't care. I hurriedly walked toward the exit, almost tripping over my own feet in my desperation to get away from the man. I stepped off the bus and turned back to check if he was following me, but the bus was already pulling away. I squinted into the night, looking for any sign of him. There was nothing. The bus had driven off into the distance, and I was left standing on the dark, empty street. But then I heard it. A voice, low and distant like an echo from far away. "You shouldn't have gotten off." I turned around, panic creeping into my chest. There was no one there. The street was completely empty, no one in sight. I blinked, thinking I had imagined it, but then I felt it. Someone was behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The man was there again, standing just a few feet away, his pale eyes staring into mine. "You were supposed to stay on," he whispered, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place. Before I could react, he stepped closer, and I felt a coldness wash over me, like the air had suddenly dropped to freezing. His hand reached out, and I felt a sharp pain shoot through my chest, like icy fingers were digging into my ribs. I stumbled backward, gasping for air. My head was spinning, and I felt dizzy, like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. But then, just as quickly as it had happened, the sensation was gone. The cold, the pressure. It all vanished. The man was gone, too. And for a moment, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it all. But when I looked down at my chest, I saw something that wasn't supposed to be there. A mark, a faint imprint like a handprint, burned into my skin. I never took that bus route again. I never went near that street again. And to this day, when I look out into the dark, sometimes I can still feel those eyes on me, waiting.
Next story.
It was a night just like any other, or so I thought. I was heading home after a long day at the office, my feet dragging as I walked towards the bus stop. The cold had settled in, the air sharp and biting, typical for late October. There was a slight chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off. I had a few minutes to kill before the bus would arrive, so I leaned against the metal pole at the bus stop and stared down the empty street. The silence was almost deafening. The usual hum of the city was oddly absent. No passing cars, no chatter, not even a stray animal in sight. It was as if the world had paused for a brief moment. It felt unnatural. As I waited, I noticed something strange. A figure in the distance, walking slowly down the sidewalk towards me. At first, I thought it was just another late commuter, but there was something about the way the figure moved that didn't seem quite right. The person was dragging their feet, stumbling in a way that suggested they were either drunk or hurt. But as they came closer, I could see their face, or rather, the lack of one. I froze. The figure's face was smooth, completely featureless. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin where their face should have been. My heart began to race, and I stepped back, my eyes glued to the strange figure. The figure didn't seem to notice me at first, as if they were lost in their own world. But then, slowly, their head turned towards me, and I could feel a chill in the air as though something had shifted. They raised their arm, pointing at me with a finger that was unnervingly long, like it was bending at unnatural angles. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. The figure slowly began walking towards me, their feet dragging on the concrete, and I could hear the distinct sound of their slow, deliberate steps echoing through the silent street. "Are you waiting for the bus?" The voice came, though it wasn't like any voice I had ever heard. It was distorted, as if it was being filtered through static, a warped whisper that made my skin crawl. I could barely force a nod. My mind raced with thoughts of running, of getting away from this thing that was obviously not human. But my legs felt like lead, frozen in place. The bus stop felt like it had become a trap, like I couldn't escape. The figure stepped closer, and I noticed that their bodies seemed to flicker in and out of focus, like they weren't entirely solid. One moment they were there, in front of me, and the next they seemed to fade out, as if they were slipping in and out of existence. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of a bus pulling up behind me. The headlights sliced through the dark, casting long shadows. I turned around, desperate for any sign of safety, but when I turned back, the bus wasn't there. There was nothing but the street and the still figure standing before me. The distorted voice spoke again, its tone growing more impatient. "You're not leaving, are you?" The air around me grew colder, and I could feel my breath forming mist in the air. My body was trembling now, my heart racing faster than I thought possible. I tried to back away, but I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to move. It was like the very ground beneath me had become a part of the nightmare. The figure continued to advance toward me, its movements becoming more erratic. I couldn't take it any longer. I had to escape. I had to get away. In a moment of panic, I broke free from the paralysis and bolted toward the road. My only thought was to reach the other side, to get as far away from the figure as possible. I didn't even hear the bus this time as I ran. All I could hear was the sound of my own breath, frantic and panicked, as I pushed myself harder. I reached the other side of the road, and for a split second I thought I had made it out. But when I looked back, the figure was standing directly in front of me, as if it had been waiting for me to cross. "You can't escape," the voice rasped, closer now, the distorted static filling the air. I spun around, but the world had changed. The street had disappeared, replaced by a vast, empty void, an endless blackness that stretched out before me. The bus stop was gone, replaced by an expanse of nothing. The cold air had turned to ice, and I could feel my body shaking uncontrollably. The figure stepped forward again, its featureless face now inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, and the stench of decay filled the air. The voice, that same distorted whisper, echoed in my ears. "You're already here. You've always been here. And now, you'll never leave." I tried to scream, but no sound came. My mind was spinning, trying to comprehend what was happening. Was this real? Or was I trapped in some kind of nightmare? But deep down, I knew the answer. This wasn't a dream. This was happening. The figure reached out with its long, unnatural hands, grabbing hold of my arms. Its grip was like ice, and I could feel the life being drained from me as it pulled me closer. "I'll show you the way," it said, its voice now a twisted mockery of human speech. "The way to where you belong." Before I could react, the darkness engulfed me, swallowing me whole. And then, I woke up. At least I thought I did. I was back at the bus stop. The street was quiet, and the bus was just pulling up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know if I was still dreaming or if this was reality, but I knew one thing for certain: the figure was gone. Or at least, that's what I thought. I stepped onto the bus, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had taken over my body. As I sat down, I glanced at the empty seat beside me, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something. A faint, featureless face staring back at me in the reflection of the window. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The bus ride felt like it lasted forever, but eventually I reached my stop. I quickly exited the bus and started walking toward my apartment, trying to shake off the dread that clung to me. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that I was being watched. I looked over my shoulder one last time, and there, in the distance, was the figure again, standing still, waiting. And I knew then that the nightmare wasn't over. The bus stop, it had never truly let me leave.
Next story.
I can still remember that night like it was yesterday. It was late. Too late, honestly, for someone to be waiting for a bus at a stop like the one I was at. I'd missed the last one, and the next wouldn't come for another hour, maybe more. The cold wind bit at my skin as I sat at the rundown, dimly lit bench, the only company being a flickering street lamp. The bus stop wasn't in the best part of town, but it was the one closest to my place, so I had no choice. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but the screen kept freezing every few seconds. The street was almost empty, save for a few scattered cars and the occasional rustling of leaves. It felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, like something wasn't quite right. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the time of night playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, a distant voice. At first I thought it was just the wind or a car passing by. But no, it was a voice, a man's voice. I looked around, but no one was in sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shook my head and glanced at the bus schedule posted on the wall. It was nearly midnight. Why would anyone be out here at this hour? I heard it again. This time it was closer, more distinct. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaky. Silence. I should have left then. I should have gotten up and walked down the street to the convenience store or anywhere else, but for some reason I stayed seated. It's like my body refused to listen to the voice in my head screaming at me to run. That's when I saw him. He was standing by the lamppost across the street, barely visible in the darkness. Just a silhouette. A man, or what I thought was a man. He was tall, unnaturally tall, his body stiff and unmoving. I couldn't make out his face, just the vague outline of a long coat that fluttered in the wind. At first, I thought he might be waiting for the bus too, but then I remembered I hadn't seen anyone else at this stop the whole time I'd been there. No one had come or gone. I tried to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. Maybe he was just another lost soul waiting for his ride. But something about him felt wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but his presence seemed to warp the air around him, like he was absorbing the light, the warmth, the life from everything nearby. The wind seemed to pick up, swirling around him like a vortex. I should have left then. I should have run. But I didn't. My legs were frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to look away, but my eyes wouldn't obey. And then he spoke. "Waiting for a bus, are you?" His voice was low, almost too soft to hear, but it sent a chill down my spine, rattling my bones. The air felt colder now, much colder than it had been just moments before. I blinked, trying to focus, but when I looked back, he was closer, much closer, standing only a few feet away, the darkness of the night swallowing him whole. I jumped up, my heart racing. "What do you want?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, but the figure didn't respond. He only stared at me with dark, hollow eyes, his face now visible. Or at least, what I thought was his face. His skin was pale, too pale, and stretched tight over sharp, unnatural features. His eyes were sunken, black pits with no light, no emotion. His mouth was cracked open in a grotesque smile, wide and unnatural, as if it had been forced into place. The more I looked at him, the more wrong everything about him felt. His skin seemed to shift and ripple like it didn't belong to a living person at all. My instincts screamed at me to run, to scream, to do anything, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. "You've been waiting for a while, haven't you?" The figure's voice was almost a whisper now, as though it was brushing against my mind rather than my ears. "The bus will be here soon." I glanced at the road again, desperately hoping to see headlights, but there was nothing. The road was empty, not a single car in sight. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his long coat trailing behind him, fluttering in the wind. "The bus... It's always on time," he said, his voice growing louder, more distorted with each word. "It's just a matter of when you'll get on it." I didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" His smile grew wider, the edges of his mouth stretching far beyond what should have been possible. I took a step back, bumping into the cold metal of the bus stop sign. I felt trapped, cornered. His presence was suffocating, as if he was pulling the very air out of my lungs. I couldn't breathe. Then in the distance, I saw it, the bus. But it wasn't like any bus I had ever seen. It was huge, its lights glowing an eerie, sickly green, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural heat. The figure took another step forward, his eyes locked on mine, and he whispered, "The bus always arrives, but once you get on, there's no getting off." I turned and ran as fast as I could, not caring about the bus anymore, not caring about anything but getting away from him. I heard his footsteps behind me, too slow, like he was savoring the chase. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally stopped and looked around, the bus stop was gone. It wasn't just empty, it had vanished entirely. There was no sign of the street, no familiar landmarks, nothing but a vast, open field stretching out before me. I didn't know where I was anymore. I don't remember how I got back to my apartment that night, but when I finally made it inside, I locked the door behind me and didn't leave for days. I told myself it had all been a nightmare, just a trick of my mind. But that night haunts me. It always will. I haven't seen him since, at least not in person. But sometimes, when I'm waiting at a bus stop late at night, I hear that voice again. Soft, distant, like the wind. "Waiting for a bus, are you?" And I know the bus will come again, and next time it might be me who gets on.
Next story.
It was an ordinary Thursday night when I found myself at that bus stop. I had been running late for work all week, and this night was no different. I had just missed the last bus, but as I walked down the deserted street, I noticed a new bus stop had been installed. It was at the far end of the block, tucked between two old buildings I had never seen before, hidden in the shadows of the night. It wasn't even listed on the city's bus route map, but I figured it had been recently added, a new stop for late-night commuters. The street was eerily quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind. The air felt heavy, thick, with an unusual stillness that seemed to hang in the air. There were no streetlights in the area, so the only light came from the half-lit bus shelter itself. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my friend asking if I had made it home yet. I quickly typed back that I had just missed the bus and that I was waiting for the next one. I was about to put my phone back in my pocket when I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer from the end of the block. I turned, expecting to see someone else waiting for the bus, but no one was there. I dismissed it, shaking my head and telling myself I was just tired, maybe imagining things. After all, I wasn't the only one who sometimes heard noises in the night when it was this quiet, right? But still, I couldn't ignore the chill that crept over me, that feeling that I wasn't alone. I leaned against the cold metal pole of the bus stop and stared at the dark, empty street, hoping for the sound of a bus arriving. But nothing came. Minutes dragged on. I glanced down at my watch. It had been more than 20 minutes. I looked at the time on my phone, only to see that it was somehow an hour later than it should have been. My heart began to pound in my chest, a wave of unease sweeping over me. I pulled out my phone again to double-check the time. The screen flickered for a second, then went black. I pressed the power button, but nothing happened. That's when I heard the footsteps again, much closer now, like someone was right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see another late night traveler, but the street was still empty. There were no cars, no people, just shadows. Hello? I called out into the night, my voice trembling slightly. Is someone there? There was no response. The silence felt suffocating, and I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, I saw movement in the shadows. A figure, dark and indistinct, slowly appeared at the far end of the bus stop. At first, I thought it was a person, but as it drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure was tall, too tall. Its legs were long, much longer than they should have been, and its body seemed to stretch unnaturally. As it got closer, I could make out more details, but they only made it worse. Its face was obscured, not by darkness, but by a smooth, featureless mask. A mask of polished bone, cold and gleaming in the faint light of the bus stop. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, were two hollow pits, deep and black. I froze, my entire body going numb. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, and my throat was dry as dust. The figure took another step forward, then another, moving slowly and deliberately toward me. "What do you want?" I stammered, barely able to form the words. I didn't know why I spoke. I didn't want to know. The figure didn't respond. It just continued to move closer, its long, unnerving limbs twisting and bending in unnatural ways, as if it were stretching its body to fit the space between us. My breath caught in my throat as the air around me seemed to grow heavier, colder. I could feel the temperature drop rapidly, the chill biting through my coat as though winter had come too soon. I looked up, and there, in the distance, I saw the faint glow of headlights. The bus. It was coming. I had to make it to the bus. In a flash, my body sprang into motion. I turned and sprinted towards the bus, every fiber of my being screaming for me to reach it before the figure could catch up to me. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, chasing me, getting closer with every passing second. I reached the bus, throwing myself onto the steps just as I heard the figure's voice, a low, guttural whisper that made my skin crawl. Too late. I twisted around, gasping for air, but the figure was gone. The street was empty once more, and the bus doors slammed shut behind me. I quickly found an empty seat near the back, my hands shaking violently as I clutched the armrests. The bus started to move, and I stared out of the window, trying to calm my racing heart. As the bus rolled down the street, I looked back at the bus stop, but it was no longer there. The street, the shelter, the pole, all of it had vanished. It was just an empty patch of asphalt now, well, like the bus stop had never existed. The bus ride was uneventful after that, and I eventually reached my stop. I hurried off, trying to shake off the nightmare I had just experienced. I wasn't sure if it was real or just some strange trick of the mind. Maybe I had been sleepwalking. Maybe it was all just my imagination running wild. But when I got home, I looked at my phone again. The time on my phone was still wrong, an hour later than it should have been. And on the screen, there was a new notification. A message from an unknown number. It simply said, "See you soon." I haven't taken that bus since, and every time I walk past that corner, I still feel that same unease, like something is waiting for me, just out of sight in the shadows.
Next story.
It was an unusually warm night for November, and I had just finished working a late shift at the convenience store. I was exhausted, but I couldn't ignore the fact that I had missed my bus. Again. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. I didn't want to call a cab because I was low on cash, so I decided to wait for the next bus. The stop was at the corner of a busy street, an area I'd walked through countless times before. The streetlights buzzed overhead and the cars whizzed by in the distance. There was a soft wind, the kind that made the trees sway gently, but the evening felt different, almost too still. The world around me was oddly quiet. No pedestrians, no voices, just the distant hum of traffic. I glanced at the time on my phone. It was after midnight, and I had been waiting for nearly 30 minutes. The bus was supposed to arrive soon, but the minutes stretched out as if they were somehow being pulled into an endless void. Then, I heard it. A soft shuffle of feet from behind me. I turned, expecting to see another late-night traveler at the stop, but there was no one there. I squinted into the darkness, my heartbeat quickening as the silence lingered. There was something off about this moment, something unnerving that I couldn't put my finger on. I was about to turn back when I heard it again. The shuffle, Closer this time, my heart skipped a beat. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness of the street. Is someone there? No answer. Just the faint shuffle of footsteps, now unmistakable. I took a hesitant step backward, my eyes darting around, but I still couldn't see anyone. And then, from the shadows just beyond the bus shelter, I saw a figure step forward. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette, just a vague shape moving against the backdrop of the night. But as the figure drew closer, I could make out more details. It was a man, tall, with a hunched posture. His clothes were tattered, ragged, as if they had been worn for years. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were wide and vacant, like there was nothing behind them. I froze, my body suddenly stiff with fear. He stepped closer, dragging one foot behind him with each shuffling step, as if he were struggling to move. His hand, pale and bony, reached out toward me, fingers curling like claws. Help me. His voice was a rasp, a low and distorted sound that sent a cold shiver down my spine. Please. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know what to do. There was no one else around. The streets were empty. My legs felt like lead, unable to move. The man took another step forward, and I backed away, my heart racing in my chest. I should have left, should have run, but something held me in place. I looked at his face, those hollow eyes, and I felt a deep, unsettling sense of dread. Are you lost? I managed to choke out, my voice shaking. He nodded, his head jerking unnaturally, like it was almost too big for his neck. His mouth didn't move when he spoke again. Can you help me? Find my way home? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I glanced over at the streetlights, hoping that someone would pass by, hoping the bus would arrive. But there was no one. The road was still. The man took another step forward, his face twisting into a grotesque smile, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide, too wide, stretching across his face as if it shouldn't be there. And as he smiled, the air around me seemed to grow colder. You don't understand, he whispered, his voice growing louder, more insistent. I'm not lost. I'm right here. I felt a chill seep into my bones. The bus had to come soon. It had to. But as I glanced down the road, there was no sign of it. The world felt like it was closing in around me. I could hear the man's breathing now, deep and labored, like he was suffocating under the weight of his own presence. I turned to run, but before I could take a single step, I felt his cold hand grab my arm, his grip tight and unyielding. I tried to yank away, but his fingers were like iron, digging into my skin. You don't get it, he said again, his voice so close now that I could feel it in my bones. I'm always here. I looked down at his hand on my arm, and to my horror, I saw that his fingers were beginning to melt into my skin, like they were part of me, fusing with me. I screamed, finally finding my voice, and I tore myself away from him with all my strength. I stumbled backward, and when I looked up, the man was gone. He had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving me alone at the bus stop, gasping for breath. The bus arrived just moments later, and I didn't think twice. I boarded, my heart pounding in my chest, and I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The rest of the ride was uneventful, but when I reached my stop, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I stepped off the bus, I glanced up at the street where the bus stop had been, but it was gone. The shelter, the pole, everything had disappeared. In its place was just an empty lot, the ground barren and overgrown with weeds. There was no trace of the bus stop at all, and that's when I realized the truth. The bus stop had never been there. I never saw that man again, but sometimes when I pass by that empty lot, I hear the faint shuffle of footsteps, always behind me, always just out of sight. And sometimes, when I look around, I swear I can feel those hollow eyes staring at me, waiting.
Next story.
I had been working late again, and the night was as quiet as it ever got in the city. It was nearly 1 a.m., and the street was desolate. The office building I worked in was in a sketchy part of town, and I never liked being there after hours. But this time, I had no choice. Too much work to get done. By the time I packed up and locked up the office, the air outside was cold, biting at my skin. The bus stop was just a block away, and I didn't want to wait for a cab. The night felt thick with something I couldn't place, an unnatural stillness in the air, almost like the city had gone to sleep, but I was still awake. The bus stop was on a quiet corner, illuminated by a single streetlight. As I walked toward it, I saw a few people already waiting. Just a few shadows in the dark, hunched over, not speaking. I didn't think much of it at first. It was late, after all. People were tired. But as I got closer, I noticed one thing that stood out. The man standing by the bus stop had his back to me. He was standing oddly still, like he was waiting. Not for a bus, but for something else. I couldn't help but glance at him as I approached. He wore a long dark coat that was too long for his body, as if it swallowed him up. The collar was turned up, obscuring his face. I didn't like the way his presence made the air feel even colder. It wasn't just the chill of the night, but something about him felt wrong. I kept walking, trying to avoid making eye contact. But as I passed by, the man shifted. I wasn't sure if he moved or if my mind had just registered him differently, but then I noticed the thing that made my stomach turn. His shoes. They were facing forward, planted firmly on the ground, but his body was turned 90 degrees facing the opposite direction. At that moment, I realized something else. There was no sound, no footfalls, no breathing, no rustling of clothing. Nothing. My pulse quickened, but I kept my gaze straight ahead. I didn't want to make a scene, especially in such a quiet neighborhood. I reached the bus stop and stood next to the other few people waiting. They were just as still as the man, hunched figures, unmoving, like statues. But then I noticed something else. Each of them had their hands gripped tightly around the handles of their bags or their coats, their eyes focused forward, never looking at each other or anyone else. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one where time had paused and the usual rhythms of life had slowed down. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I looked back at the man, but he was still standing there, his body twisted impossibly, facing the wrong way. The bus couldn't come soon enough. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. I felt like I was trapped in that moment, stuck with these strangers. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I tried to calm my nerves. It was a late-night bus stop. People were tired, and I shouldn't overthink it. That's all it was. But the longer I stood there, the more I couldn't shake the thought that something was terribly wrong. And that's when I saw it. The man's head. It tilted, just slightly, as if he was listening to something. The motion was unnatural, jerky, like it wasn't supposed to happen. But there was more. His eyes, visible now under the collar of his coat, were black. Pitch black, as if they were holes that consumed all light. No whites, no pupils, nothing, just pure void. I turned away quickly, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing watching me. I needed to leave. The bus had to come now. Just then, a soft clicking sound echoed from the darkness beyond the bus stop. At first, I couldn't place it, like a soft metallic noise, almost rhythmic, like something tapping against the ground. My skin prickled, and I tried to ignore it, trying to focus on the bus stop sign. I glanced up at it, just to calm myself. And then I saw it, the sign. It had changed. It was no longer a simple route number. It now had words scrawled across it in jagged, messy writing. Don't look back. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen anyone approach the stop, so how could anyone have changed the sign? I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. I heard the tapping sound again, this time closer. Louder. I took a deep breath and forced myself to turn my head. My gaze flicked back to the man, and then he moved. It wasn't a normal movement. It wasn't a step or a shuffle. It was more like he was dragged, his limbs jerking unnaturally as his body rotated around, his neck twisting far too far like something inside him was breaking. I didn't wait another second. I turned and ran. I sprinted down the street, not daring to look back, my breath coming in short gasps. My body screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't. I had to get away from that bus stop, from that thing, from whatever was happening. I rounded the corner and kept running and lungs burned until I was far away from that place. I glanced over my shoulder once, just to check. But when I looked back, I couldn't see the bus stop anymore. It wasn't there. It was like it had disappeared. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't know if it was a trick of the mind or something worse. I still don't know what happened that night. But one thing is for sure, I've never taken that route home again.
Next story.
It was a Friday night, and the city was drenched in the neon glow of streetlights, the air thick with humidity. I had stayed late at work again, caught up in an endless loop of paperwork and emails. By the time I left the building, it was already after midnight. I didn't have a car, so I was left with the grim reality of waiting for the bus like I always did when I worked these late hours. There was a bus stop a couple of blocks down from my office, right at the intersection of two empty streets. It was always eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made you feel like something was lurking just out of sight. But on that night, something about it felt different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a strange pull to take a different route to the stop. I didn't know why, but I walked faster, my footsteps quickening on the sidewalk. The night felt like it was closing in on me. I turned the corner and was met with a sight I hadn't expected: a new bus stop. It was a temporary shelter, one I hadn't seen before. The overhead sign was cracked, and the glass panels of the shelter were streaked with grime. But there was no mistaking it. This wasn't the usual stop I used. The street was empty, the occasional car driving by, but there were no other pedestrians in sight. Still, I stepped into the shelter, figuring that maybe they had just changed the location for tonight. I checked my phone. No messages, no notifications. My bus was due in about 10 minutes. Perfect timing, I thought. I stood there for a moment, listening to the distant hum of the city, but as I glanced around, I noticed something strange. The shadows around the shelter were too deep, like they were moving. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on my tiredness, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt as if something was watching me. I turned to look the street and saw a figure standing at the far end of the block, under the dim light of a street lamp. At first, I thought it was just someone waiting for the bus like me, but the figure didn't move, didn't even shift its weight, as if it were frozen in place. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was just my overactive imagination, but something in the pit of my stomach told me to leave. I stepped out of the shelter and glanced around, hoping to see someone else, anyone, to reassure me that I wasn't alone. But the street remained empty. The figure was still standing there, its back turned toward me. I could see it now more clearly. The shape of it. It was a man, or at least it seemed like a man. His clothes were out of place for the season, as if he were wearing a heavy winter coat despite the warmth of the evening. But it wasn't just the oddity of his clothing that unnerved me. It was the way he stood. His posture was stiff, like he was holding perfectly still, almost unnaturally so. I thought of calling out to him, but I couldn't find my voice. The bus came into view just as I turned to look at the street sign to check for my route. I hurried back toward the shelter, relieved that my bus was finally arriving. The figure remained in the same spot, unmoving. I wanted to look away, to pretend like I hadn't seen him, but my eyes were drawn back to him. I boarded the bus and found an empty seat near the back. As the bus started moving, I glanced out the window, my heart pounding. The figure was still standing there, except now he was facing me. His face. I could finally see his face. It wasn't just any face, it was an empty, hollow face. His skin was pale and smooth, devoid of any detail, like someone had erased every feature. No eyes, no mouth, just a featureless mask of skin. The bus accelerated and I could feel my stomach drop, as if I was being pulled into the depths of the city's darkness. I forced myself to look away, but the image of that face, empty, frozen, and staring, haunted me. I didn't get off at my usual stop. Instead, I took the bus all the way to the terminal, my heart still racing. I rushed off the bus and looked back at the road behind me, half expecting to see the figure there, following me. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty streets. I never took that bus again, and I never spoke of what I saw. But every now and then, when I'm walking late at night, I can still feel the weight of those eyes, and I hear the soft rustling of feet moving in the shadows, always just behind me, never too far away.